Queen Camilla stepped out of the sleek black car and felt the weight of history on her shoulders. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fresh polish and leather from the nearby military quarters. Wellington Barracks stood before her like a fortress of tradition, its red brick walls having witnessed countless royal ceremonies over the decades. She adjusted her navy blue coat one final time and checked that her small hat was sitting perfectly straight. Every detail mattered today. This wasn't just any ordinary visit. This was her first official Trooping the Color rehearsal as Queen Consort, and she knew that hundreds of eyes would be watching her every move. Some would be looking for perfection, others for any sign of weakness. The sound of her heels clicked against the concrete as she walked toward the parade ground. In the distance, she could see the Coldstream Guards lined up in their famous red tunics and black bearskin hats. Even from far away, they looked like something from a postcard, standing so still they might have been statues. Their rifles gleamed in the sunlight, and their boots were polished to mirror perfection. For weeks, she had been preparing for this moment. Her private secretary had given her thick folders filled with protocols and procedures. She had studied every page, memorizing the exact sequence of events, the proper responses to military honors, and even the correct angle to hold her head when receiving salutes. The palace staff had arranged practice sessions where she walked through empty corridors, rehearsing her steps and practicing her smile, but no amount of preparation could calm the butterflies dancing in her stomach. She had attended many royal events as the Duchess of Cornwall, but this felt completely different. Now she carried the title of Queen Consort, a role that came with expectations she was still learning to understand. The British people had watched her journey for years, and opinions about her remained divided. Some had embraced her warmly, while others still viewed her as an outsider trying to fill shoes that could never truly fit. As she walked closer to the parade ground, she could see more details coming into focus. The guards stood in perfect lines, their formation so precise it looked like it had been drawn with a ruler. Their faces were serious and focused, showing no emotion whatsoever. This was military discipline at its finest, the kind of professionalism that had made the British Army famous around the world. The morning sun caught the gold threads in their uniforms, creating tiny sparks of light that danced across the parade ground. Behind the guards, she could see family members and military officials gathered in a special viewing area. Children pressed against the barriers, their eyes wide with excitement at seeing real palace guards up close. Cameras were everywhere, both official photographers and curious onlookers, capturing every moment on their phones. Queen Camilla had been told that today's ceremony would be relatively simple compared to the actual Trooping the Color event. This was just a rehearsal, a chance for everyone to practice their roles before the real thing. But she knew that even rehearsals mattered. The guards took their duties seriously, and they expected the same level of commitment from everyone involved. Including her, she thought back to all the stories her husband had told her about these ceremonies. King Charles had grown up attending these events, first as a young prince watching his mother receive the honors, and later as an active participant. He had tried to prepare her for the formality and precision of military protocol, but experiencing it firsthand was completely different from hearing about it secondhand. The closer she got to the guards, the more impressed she became with their bearing. These weren't just soldiers playing dress-up for tourists. These were professional warriors who had served their country in dangerous places around the world. Many of them had medals pinned to their chests, small pieces of metal that represented acts of courage and sacrifice that most people could never imagine. She could see Colonel Pemberton waiting for her near the front of the formation. He looked exactly like what someone would expect from a British military officer, with his perfectly groomed mustache and ramrod-straight posture. His uniform was immaculate, without a single wrinkle or speck of dust anywhere to be seen. She had met him briefly at other royal functions, and he had always been polite and professional. The sound of her footsteps seemed to echo across the parade ground as she approached the moment of truth. This was when she would receive her first official military honors as Queen Consort. The guards would present arms, their commanding officer would offer the traditional greeting, and she would respond with the appropriate royal acknowledgement. It was a dance that had been performed thousands of times before, a ritual that connected her to every monarch who had come before. But as she drew nearer to the waiting guards, she began to notice something that made her heart skip a beat. The lead guard, a tall man with years of service medals across his chest, was standing at attention, but something about his posture seemed different. His eyes were focused straight ahead as they should be, but there was a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there when she had observed other ceremonies from a distance. The man's nameplate read Harrison, and she could see that he held the rank of Sergeant Major. She had been briefed about him earlier. He was considered one of the finest soldiers in the regiment, a man who had served with distinction for over 2 decades. His record was spotless, his dedication unquestioned. If anyone represented the heart and soul of the Coldstream Guards, it was him. As Queen Camilla took her final steps toward the formation, she felt a strange shift in the atmosphere around her. The morning that had started with such promise and possibility suddenly felt heavier, as if storm clouds were gathering overhead. The guards remained perfectly still, but there was something in the air that suggested this ceremony might not go exactly as planned. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin slightly, drawing on every lesson in royal deportment she had ever received. Whatever was about to happen, she would face it with dignity and grace. The eyes of the nation were upon her, and she was determined to prove that she was worthy of the trust that had been placed in her. The moment of truth was just seconds away, and Queen Camilla prepared herself to receive the honors that were rightfully hers as the wife of the king. She had no idea that this beautiful morning was about to become one of the most challenging moments of her royal career, a test that would shake her confidence and force her to question everything she thought she knew about earning respect and acceptance in the most traditional institution in Britain. Queen Camilla reached the exact spot where she was supposed to stop and receive the traditional royal salute. Her heart was beating faster than usual, but she kept her breathing steady and her smile confident. This was the moment she had practiced for weeks. The moment when the guards would honor her new position as queen consort with the same respect they had shown to generations of royals before her. She stood perfectly still, waiting for the familiar sound of rifles being raised in unison, and the crisp command that would signal the beginning of the ceremony. The morning breeze carried the faint sound of traffic from the streets beyond the barracks, but here on the parade ground, everything felt frozen in time. Sergeant Major Harrison stood directly in front of her, no more than 10 feet away. She could see his face clearly now, weathered and serious, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into foreign suns and facing dangers most people never had to imagine. His uniform was absolutely perfect, every button gleaming, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, but something was wrong. The silence stretched on longer than it should have. Queen Camilla had attended enough military ceremonies to know the rhythm of these events. By now, the sergeant major should have called his men to present arms. The familiar words should have echoed across the parade ground, followed by the synchronized movement of dozens of rifles rising to shoulder height. Instead, Harrison remained motionless, his hands at his sides, his eyes fixed on some invisible point directly above her head. His jaw was set in a way that suggested this wasn't an accident or a moment of confusion. This was a deliberate choice. Queen Camilla felt her smile waver slightly, though she fought to keep it in place. She glanced quickly toward Colonel Pemberton, who was standing off to the side with a look of growing concern on his face. He had clearly noticed the same thing she had. This wasn't how the ceremony was supposed to go. The other guards remained perfectly still, following their sergeant major's lead as they had been trained to do. In the military, you followed orders and trusted your superiors, even when you didn't understand their reasoning. If Harrison wasn't saluting, then neither would they. The silence became uncomfortable, then awkward, then downright painful. Queen Camilla could feel the eyes of everyone watching her, waiting to see how she would handle this unprecedented situation. The photographers were still clicking away, capturing every second of what was clearly becoming a very unusual moment in royal history. She tried to understand what was happening. Had there been some change in protocol that she hadn't been told about? Was this some new tradition she was supposed to know about? But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. She had studied every aspect of these ceremonies and nothing in any of the documents had mentioned anything like this. Colonel Pemberton stepped forward slightly, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. She could see him making small hand gestures toward Harrison, trying to signal that something needed to happen immediately. But the sergeant major didn't even glance in his direction. His focus remained absolutely fixed, his posture unchanged. Queen Camilla realized that she was witnessing something that had probably never happened before in the long history of the British monarchy. A member of the royal family was being deliberately snubbed by the very soldiers who were sworn to protect and honor the crown. It was unprecedented, shocking, and happening right in front of dozens of witnesses and cameras, the family members. In the viewing area had gone quiet. Parents stopped chatting and children stopped pointing excitedly at the guards. Everyone could sense that something was seriously wrong, even if they didn't understand exactly what it was. The atmosphere that had been so festive and celebratory just minutes earlier now felt tense and uncomfortable. Queen Camilla's mind raced as she tried to figure out how to respond. Should she say something? Should she wait longer? Should she simply walk away and pretend this had never happened? None of her preparation had covered a situation like this. All of her practice sessions had assumed that the guards would follow the normal protocol. She thought about her husband, King Charles, and how disappointed he would be to learn that his wife had been treated this way by his own military. She thought about the British people watching at home, trying to decide what they thought about their new queen consort. Most of all, she thought about Queen Elizabeth, the woman whose role she was trying to fill, and wondered what she would have done in this situation. Harrison's refusal wasn't just about military protocol. Queen Camilla understood that much, even without knowing the full details of his reasoning. This was about something deeper, something more personal. The guards had served Queen Elizabeth for decades, watching her age gracefully while maintaining her dignity and devotion to duty. They had been at her funeral, carrying her coffin and saying goodbye to the only monarch most of them had ever known. Now they were being asked to show the same level of respect to someone who many people still viewed as an outsider, someone who had married into the royal family rather than being born into it, someone whose path to the throne had been complicated and controversial in ways that Queen Elizabeth never was. The cameras kept clicking, and Queen Camilla knew that. These pictures would be on the front page of every newspaper in Britain tomorrow morning. The headlines would write themselves: Royal snub, military rebellion, Queen Camilla humiliated. She could already imagine the field day that certain sections of the press would have with this story, but she also understood something else in that moment of painful silence. Harrison wasn't doing this to be cruel or disrespectful in a petty way. She could see in his bearing and the way he held himself that this was eating him up inside too. This was a man torn between his military duty and his personal convictions, making a choice that would probably cost him his career, but that he felt he had to make anyway. The wind picked up slightly, causing the flags on the nearby poles to flutter and snap. The sound seemed unusually loud in the silence that had fallen over the parade ground. Queen Camilla realized that everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. She made a decision. Rather than stand there indefinitely, waiting for a salute that clearly wasn't coming, she would handle this situation with as much grace as she could manage. She would show these soldiers and everyone watching that she was stronger than they might have expected. Taking a small step forward, Queen Camilla looked directly at Sergeant Major Harrison for the first time since arriving at the parade ground. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment she saw something that surprised her. It wasn't hatred or disrespect that she saw in his gaze. It was pain, conflict, and a kind of desperate loyalty to something he felt he was losing. The moment stretched between them. Two people from completely different worlds, caught in a situation that neither of them had wanted, but that both of them now had to navigate somehow. Queen Camilla felt her feet wanting to move, but she forced herself to stay exactly where she was. Running away would make everything worse. She had learned long ago that royal life meant facing difficult moments with dignity, even when every instinct told her to escape. But this situation was testing that resolve like never before. The silence had gone on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 30 seconds. In royal ceremonies, 30 seconds of unexpected silence might as well be 30 minutes. Everyone knew something was terribly wrong, and the tension was becoming unbearable. Colonel Pemberton couldn't take it anymore. She watched as he stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment and anger. His military training was fighting with his sense of protocol, and protocol was winning. He moved with quick, sharp steps toward Sergeant Major Harrison, his boots clicking loudly against the concrete. "Sergeant Major," he said in a voice that was meant to be quiet but carried clearly across the silent parade ground. His words had the edge of a man who was trying very hard not to lose his temper in public. "Present arms to Her Majesty immediately." Harrison didn't even blink. His eyes remained fixed on that invisible point above Queen Camilla's head, as if he hadn't heard the order at all. His breathing was steady, his posture unchanged. If anything, his jaw seemed to set even more firmly. Colonel Pemberton stepped closer, close enough that Queen Camilla could see the veins standing out on his neck. "That was a direct order, Sergeant Major. Present arms to Her Majesty, the Queen Consort. Now." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to spread. Queen Camilla realized that she was watching something that went far beyond a simple breach of protocol. This was a moment that would be talked about for years to come, analyzed and debated in military academies and royal biographies. Behind Harrison, the other guards remained perfectly still. She could see the conflict in some of their faces now. These were disciplined soldiers who had been trained to follow orders without question, but they were also human beings with their own thoughts and feelings. Some of them looked uncomfortable, shifting slightly on their feet. Others seemed as resolved as their Sergeant Major, a young guard in the second row, barely out of his teens by the look of him, glanced nervously between Harrison and Colonel Pemberton. Queen Camilla could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. This was probably his first major ceremony, and instead of the proud moment he had been expecting, he was caught in the middle of what looked like a military rebellion. The family members in the viewing area had gone completely quiet now. Parents were pulling their children closer, sensing that something serious was happening even if they didn't understand what it was. One elderly woman, probably a military wife who had seen decades of ceremonies, had her hand pressed to her mouth in shock. Queen Camilla could hear the cameras clicking more frantically now. The photographers knew they were witnessing something historic, something that would make headlines around the world. She tried not to think about how these pictures would look in tomorrow's newspapers, or what the television commentators would say when they replayed this footage over and over again. Colonel Pemberton's voice dropped lower, but in the silence, it still carried to everyone watching. "Sergeant Major Harrison, you are placing your career and your pension in jeopardy. I'm giving you one final opportunity to follow proper protocol." For the first time since Queen Camilla had arrived, Harrison moved. But instead of raising his hand in salute, he took a half step forward and spoke in a voice that was quiet but absolutely clear. "With respect, sir, I cannot bring myself to salute someone who was not born to wear the crown." The words hit Queen Camilla like a physical blow. She felt her cheeks flush hot with embarrassment and hurt. She had expected that some people might have reservations about her role, but to hear it stated so plainly in front of all these people was more painful than she had imagined it would be. But Harrison wasn't finished. His voice remained respectful, but firm as he continued. "I served Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth for 23 years. I carried her coffin. I watched them lower her into the ground. That woman earned my salute through 7 decades of service. I cannot give the same honor to someone who has not proven herself worthy of it." The words created a ripple of gasps from the viewing area. Colonel Pemberton looked like he might faint from the shock of hearing such insubordination spoken aloud. Several of the other guards looked down at their feet, clearly uncomfortable with their Sergeant Major's public declaration. Queen Camilla felt tears threatening to form in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She would not cry in public. She would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her breakdown. But Harrison's words had found their target. hitting every insecurity and doubt she had carried about her role as queen consort. The silence that followed was even more painful than the one before. Now everyone knew exactly what this was about. This wasn't a simple mistake or misunderstanding. This was a deliberate rejection of her authority, spoken aloud for everyone to hear. A small child in the viewing area started to cry, probably sensing the tension without understanding it. His mother quickly picked him up and tried to quiet him, but the sound of his upset added another layer of discomfort to an already impossible situation. Queen Camilla found herself thinking about all the other royal women who had faced moments of public humiliation. She thought about Diana, hounded by photographers and critics. She thought about Fergie, mocked and ridiculed in the press. She thought about how Queen Elizabeth herself had faced criticism early in her reign from people who thought she was too young and inexperienced, but this felt different somehow. This was coming from the very institution that was supposed to protect and honor the monarchy. These were the king's own soldiers, the people who were meant to be the most loyal supporters of the crown. Colonel Pemberton was clearly struggling with how to handle the situation. He couldn't order the guards to arrest their own sergeant major in front of Queen Camilla and all these witnesses. But he also couldn't let this level of insubordination stand without consequences. "Sergeant Major Harrison," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "you are relieved of duty. Report to my office immediately following this ceremony." Harrison nodded once, a sharp military acknowledgement. "Yes, sir." But he still didn't salute Queen Camilla. If anything, his stance seemed even more defiant now that he had spoken his piece. Queen Camilla realized that everyone was looking at her now, waiting to see how she would respond to this unprecedented situation. The young queen consort who had been so carefully prepared for this ceremony was now facing a test that no amount of practice could have prepared her for. She took a slow, deep breath and made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Queen Camilla took that deep breath and did something that shocked everyone watching. Instead of walking away in embarrassment or demanding that someone fix this mess immediately, she stepped closer to Sergeant Major Harrison. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady and calm despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "Sergeant Major," she said quietly, "I understand your position, and I respect your loyalty to the late Queen." The words seemed to catch Harrison off guard. His eyes flickered toward her face for just a moment before returning to their fixed position. He had clearly expected anger, demands for punishment, or a royal tantrum. He hadn't expected understanding, but Queen Camilla wasn't finished. "However, I am here today not just as myself, but as the wife of your king, and while I may not have earned your personal respect yet, the crown I represent deserves the honor of your service." Her words carried across the parade ground with surprising authority. Even some of the guards who had been looking uncomfortable began to straighten their shoulders. She wasn't pleading or begging. She was simply stating facts with the kind of quiet dignity that reminded everyone present why the monarchy had survived for over 1,000 years. Harrison's face remained stone-like, but Queen Camilla thought she saw something shift in his eyes. Not agreement, necessarily, but perhaps a grudging acknowledgement that she was handling this situation better than he had expected her to. Colonel Pemberton looked like he wanted to step in and take control of the situation, but Queen Camilla raised her hand slightly, a gesture that told him to wait. She had more to say. "I cannot force you to respect me, Sergeant Major. Respect must be earned, not commanded. But I can ask you to think about what your refusal means for the institution. You have served so faithfully for more than 2 decades. In the viewing area, people were leaning forward, straining to hear every word. The photographers had stopped taking pictures for a moment, too caught up in the drama unfolding before them to remember their jobs. Even the crying child had gone. Quiet, as if sensing that something important was happening, Queen Camilla continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "When Queen Elizabeth was coronated, there were people who questioned whether a young woman could lead this nation. When she married Prince Philip, there were those who said he was unsuitable. Every generation of royals has faced doubts and criticism. But the crown endures because it represents something larger than any individual person. She paused, letting her words sink in. Harrison's jaw was still set, but she could see that he was listening, really listening, to what she was saying. I'm not asking you to forget Queen Elizabeth or to diminish her memory in any way. I'm asking you to remember that she spent her entire life serving something bigger than herself. And that service continues through those of us who come after her. The silence that followed was different from the awkward, uncomfortable quiet that had filled the parade ground earlier. This was a thoughtful silence, the kind that comes when people are processing something important, but even as Queen Camilla spoke with such composure, she could feel the weight of what was happening pressing down on her shoulders. She knew that. Within hours, video clips of this confrontation would be playing on every news channel in the world. Social media would explode with opinions and arguments. Royal commentators would analyze every word, every gesture, every facial expression. Some people would praise her for handling the situation with dignity. Others would see this as proof that she didn't belong in the royal family. The incident would become part of her story forever, something that would be mentioned in her obituary decades from now. Behind Harrison, she could see the other guards watching this exchange with fascination. Some of them looked torn, caught between their loyalty to their sergeant major and their duty to the crown. Others seemed impressed by Queen Camilla's calm response to such a difficult situation. The young guard in the second row was still sweating, but now it seemed to be from concentration rather than pure nervousness. He was watching his sergeant major's face, trying to read what would happen next. This was probably the most dramatic thing he had ever witnessed in his short military career. An older guard near the back of the formation had tears in his eyes. Queen Camilla realized that this situation was painful for many of these soldiers. They had loved Queen Elizabeth deeply, and they were struggling with how to honor her memory while also doing their duty to the new reign. Colonel Pemberton was shifting from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable with allowing this confrontation to continue, but unsure how to intervene without making things worse. His face was still red, but now it seemed to be from stress rather than anger. The family members in the viewing area were completely silent now, hanging on every word. Parents had stopped trying to entertain their children. Elderly veterans were watching with the intensity of people who understood exactly how serious this moment was for the future of the monarchy. Queen Camilla could see camera crews from the major news networks setting up equipment just outside the barracks gates. Word of what was happening had clearly spread beyond the immediate area. Soon there would be reporters trying to get statements from anyone who had witnessed the confrontation. She thought about her husband, King Charles, probably going about his morning routine without any idea that his wife was facing the biggest challenge of her royal career. She wondered what he would say when he found out, whether he would be proud of how she had handled herself or worried about the damage this might cause to the monarchy's reputation. But she also thought about something else. Despite the pain and embarrassment of being rejected so publicly, she was discovering something about herself that she hadn't known before. She was stronger than she had realized. She could face down a situation that would have sent many people running for cover. Sergeant Major Harrison finally moved again, this time turning his head slightly to look directly at her. For the first time since she had arrived at the barracks, they were making real eye contact. She could see the conflict in his expression, the war between his personal feelings and his military training. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice quieter than before, "I have served this crown for 23 years. I have never questioned an order or failed in my duty. But today I find myself unable to perform what should be a simple gesture of respect." Queen Camilla nodded, acknowledging his honesty. "And I understand that difficulty, Sergeant Major. Change is never easy, especially when it involves letting go of someone we loved and respected as much as Queen Elizabeth." The conversation was taking on a quality that surprised everyone watching. This wasn't just a confrontation between a royal and a soldier anymore. It was becoming something deeper, a genuine discussion about loyalty, duty, and the challenges of moving forward while honoring the past. Harrison seemed to be wrestling with something internal, some decision that was causing him visible struggle. The other guards continued to watch, waiting to see what their leader would decide to do next. The ceremony ended without the traditional salute, leaving everyone feeling like they had witnessed something that would change everything. Queen Camilla walked back to her car with her head held high, but inside she felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The drive back to Clarence House was quiet. With only the sound of London traffic and her own thoughts for company, she stared out the window as the city passed by, watching normal people going about their normal day, completely unaware that the monarchy had just faced one of its most challenging moments in decades. Shoppers carried bags down busy streets, office workers grabbed coffee from corner cafes, and children played in small parks. Life continued as usual for everyone except her phone started buzzing before she even reached home. Text messages from palace staff, missed calls from her private secretary, and urgent notifications that something big was happening in the news. She turned the phone face down on the seat beside her, not ready to deal with the storm that was clearly brewing. By the time Queen Camilla arrived at Clarence House, her staff was already in crisis mode. Her press secretary met her at the door with a tablet in hand, showing her the first news alerts that were beginning to appear online. The headlines were exactly as brutal as she had expected them to be. Royal Guard refuses to salute Queen Camilla. Military snub rocks the palace. Queen consort humiliated at ceremony. Each headline felt like a punch to the stomach, even though she had known this was coming. Within 30 minutes of the incident, video clips were already spreading across social media platforms. Someone in the viewing area had recorded the entire confrontation on their phone, and now millions of people around the world could watch Queen Camilla being rejected by the very soldiers who were supposed to honor her. The comments on these videos came fast and harsh. Some people supported Sergeant Major Harrison, calling him a hero for standing up for Queen Elizabeth's memory. They wrote things like, "Finally, someone with backbone, and he's right, she's not a real queen." Others defended Queen Camilla, praising how she had handled such a difficult situation with grace and dignity, but the divide in public opinion was sharp and painful. Queen Camilla sat in her private sitting room watching the story explode across every news channel. Sky News had royal experts analyzing every word of the confrontation. BBC was running segments about military protocol and royal precedent. Even international networks were picking up the story. The palace communications team was working frantically to control the narrative, but it felt like trying to hold back the ocean with their bare hands. They issued a carefully worded statement, calling the incident an unfortunate misunderstanding and emphasizing Queen Camilla's commitment to serving the British people. But everyone knew it was much more than a misunderstanding. King Charles was in Scotland when the news reached him. Queen Camilla could picture him in his study at Birkhall, probably pacing back and forth as he always did when he was upset. His private secretary would have briefed him on the situation, showing him the same videos and headlines that were now dominating every news outlet in the country. Her phone rang. As she saw her husband's name on the screen, she almost didn't answer, not wanting to hear the disappointment in his voice. But she knew he would be worried about her, not angry at her. "Are you all right?" were the first words out of his mouth, and she felt tears threatening for the first time since the whole thing had started. "I'm fine," she said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. "It was difficult, but I managed." Charles was quiet, for a moment probably watching the footage himself. "You handled it beautifully," he said finally. "Much better than I would have in the same situation." But even his support couldn't shield her from what was happening outside the palace walls. Social media had turned the incident into a battleground, with supporters and critics of the royal family fighting bitter arguments in comment sections, and discussion forums. Royal commentators who had spent years building careers analyzing every move the family made were having a field day. Some called it the biggest crisis for the monarchy since Diana's death. Others compared it to the abdication crisis of 1936. The most dramatic voices were predicting the end of the royal family altogether. Television talk shows that normally focused on celebrity, gossip, and light entertainment were suddenly discussing the deeper meaning of respect, duty, and legitimacy in modern Britain. Phone-in programs were flooded with callers sharing their opinions about whether Sergeant Major Harrison was a patriot or a traitor, The story had legs, as journalists liked to say, and it was running faster than anyone could control. International newspapers were picking up the coverage, with headlines appearing in French, German, Spanish, and dozens of other languages. The incident was being discussed in parliaments, university classrooms, and coffee shops around the world. Queen Camilla tried to focus on her normal routine, reviewing briefing papers for upcoming engagements and meeting with her staff about charity work. But every conversation seemed to circle back to what had happened at Wellington Barracks. Even when people tried to talk about other things, she could see the incident lurking behind their eyes. Her lady-in-waiting brought her tea and biscuits, as she did every afternoon, but the familiar ritual felt strange and hollow. Everything felt different now, as if the world had tilted slightly off its axis, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The worst part was the feeling that she had let people down. Not just her husband or the royal family, but all the people who had started to believe in her, who had begun to accept her as their queen consort. She wondered if this incident would undo years of careful work building relationships and earning trust. Her private secretary knocked gently on the door and entered with another stack of news clippings and printed social media posts. The story was spreading to countries that normally paid little attention to British royal news. American television networks were running special segments. Australian radio stations were taking calls from listeners. Even newspapers in countries without monarchies were covering the story as an example of how traditional institutions struggled to adapt to changing times, but there were some surprising voices of support too. A retired general wrote an opinion piece defending Queen Camilla's response to the situation. Several prominent military families issued statements calling Sergeant Major Harrison's behavior unacceptable. Young people on social media were creating memes that somehow managed to be both funny and supportive. The palace announced that King Charles would be returning to London earlier than planned, cutting short his Scottish visit to deal with the crisis. This news generated another wave of headlines as royal watchers speculated about what private conversations would be happening behind palace doors. Queen Camilla knew that the next few days would be crucial. How she responded to this challenge, how the royal family handled the fallout, and how the public ultimately judged the incident would shape her reign for years to come. The young woman who had once been dismissed as unsuitable for royal life was now facing the biggest test of her strength and character. As evening fell over London, Queen Camilla stood at her window looking out at the city lights, knowing that somewhere out there, millions of people were still talking about what had happened that morning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new headlines, and new tests of her resolve. King Charles arrived back in London that evening, his usual calm demeanor replaced by visible tension. The helicopter landed on the palace grounds just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the courtyard where he had played as a child. Now, as king, he was facing a crisis that threatened everything his family had worked to build over decades. He went straight to his private study, a room filled with paintings of his ancestors and books about constitutional history. Tonight, those portraits seemed to be watching him with particular intensity, as if asking how he would handle this unprecedented challenge to royal authority. His private secretary was already waiting with a thick folder of documents, press clippings, and urgent messages from government officials. The first call he made was to the Secretary of Defense. The conversation was tense but respectful, both men understanding that they were dealing with something that had never happened before in modern British history. A serving soldier had publicly rejected the authority of the crown, and both the military and the monarchy needed to respond carefully. "Your Majesty," the defense secretary said, his voice strained through the secure phone line, "I want you to know that Sergeant Major Harrison's actions do not represent the views of Her Majesty's armed forces. The vast majority of our personnel remain absolutely loyal to the crown and to your family." King Charles appreciated the reassurance, but he knew the situation was more complicated than simple loyalty or disloyalty. Harrison wasn't a rebel or a troublemaker. His military record was spotless, his service exemplary. This was a good man struggling with genuine emotions about change and loss. "I understand the sergeant major's position," Charles replied carefully. "He served my mother faithfully for over 2 decades. His loyalty to her memory is actually admirable, even if his expression of it was inappropriate." The defense secretary seemed surprised by the king's measured response. He had probably expected anger, demands for immediate punishment, or calls for Harrison to be court-martialed. Instead, he was hearing something that sounded almost like understanding. Meanwhile, across London at Wellington Barracks, Sergeant Major Harrison was sitting in Colonel Pemberton's office, facing the biggest crisis of his military career. The room was small and functional, with regimental flags on the walls and photos of past commanding officers watching from their frames. Harrison had been in this office many times before, usually for commendations or routine briefings. Never for anything like this. Colonel Pemberton was pacing behind his desk, still trying to understand how one of his best soldiers had created such a massive international incident. His phone had been ringing constantly since the afternoon, with calls from superior officers, government officials, and reporters trying to get statements about what had happened. "Do you understand what you've done?" Pemberton asked, his voice a mixture of anger and genuine bewilderment. "This isn't just about you anymore, Harrison. This is about the reputation of the entire regiment, the military, and the crown itself." Harrison sat perfectly straight in his chair, his hands resting on his knees in the same position he had maintained during thousands of military briefings. His face showed no emotion, but his eyes revealed the internal struggle that was tearing him apart. "Sir, I understand the consequences of my actions," he said quietly. "I knew what would happen when I made my decision this morning. But I also knew I couldn't live with myself if I gave honors to someone I don't believe has earned them." The honesty in his voice was painful to hear. This wasn't a soldier trying to make excuses or avoid responsibility. This was a man who had made a choice that he knew would probably end his career, and he was prepared to face whatever came next. Back at Buckingham Palace, King Charles was meeting with his closest advisors in the ornate blue drawing room. The meeting included his private secretary, the palace communications director, and several constitutional experts who had been called in to help navigate this unprecedented situation. The conversation was intense and wide-ranging, touching on everything from military law to public relations strategy. Some advisors pushed for severe punishment of Harrison, arguing that any tolerance for such behavior would encourage similar incidents in the future. Others suggested a more measured approach, recognizing that heavy-handed punishment might only generate more sympathy for the sergeant major. "We need to remember," said one of the constitutional experts, "that the monarchy's strength has always come from its ability to adapt and evolve. If we respond to this crisis with wisdom rather than anger, we might actually emerge stronger than before." King Charles listened to all the different viewpoints, but his mind kept returning to his wife. He thought about how composed she had been during the confrontation, how she had handled an impossible situation with dignity and grace. He was proud of her, but he also knew how much the incident had hurt her personally. The palace communications team was working around the clock, monitoring social media, tracking news coverage, and trying to understand how public opinion was developing. The early signs were mixed, but not entirely negative. While some people supported Harrison's position, many others were praising Queen Camilla's calm response to the situation. Young people, in particular, seemed impressed by how she had handled the confrontation. Social media posts from teenagers and young adults praised her for not losing her temper or demanding immediate punishment for Harrison. They saw her response as mature and thoughtful, qualities they valued in their leaders. At the same time, military families were struggling with divided loyalties. Many of them understood Harrison's emotional connection to Queen Elizabeth, but they also recognized that his behavior had put the entire military in an awkward position. Retired officers were writing letters to newspapers, some supporting Harrison's right to his feelings, others condemning his breach of military discipline. The international reaction was equally complex. European monarchies were watching nervously, wondering if similar challenges to royal authority might emerge in their own countries. Republican movements in several nations were using the incident as evidence that monarchy was an outdated institution that couldn't command genuine respect in the modern world, but there were also unexpected sources of support. A group of American military veterans issued a statement defending the principle of respecting legitimate authority, even when personal feelings might suggest otherwise. Several Commonwealth nations reaffirmed their loyalty to the Crown and to King Charles personally. As midnight approached, Harrison was still in Colonel Pemberton's office, both men exhausted by hours of difficult conversation. Phone calls had come in from military headquarters, government offices, and even some reporters who had somehow gotten the base's phone number. "What happens now, sir?" Harrison asked, breaking a long silence. Pemberton looked at this soldier who had served with such distinction for so many years, now facing the end of his career because of a moment of conscience. "That's not entirely up to me anymore," he admitted. "This has gone far beyond regimental discipline. Decisions about your future will probably be made at the highest levels of government and the palace." Harrison nodded, understanding that his fate was now in the hands of people he had never met, people who would judge his actions based on political considerations, rather than personal knowledge of his character and service record. Back at Clarence House, Queen Camilla was preparing for bed, but sleep seemed impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Harrison's face, heard his words about not being worthy of the salute. The personal rejection hurt more than all the negative headlines and social media comments combined. She wondered what Queen Elizabeth would have done in the same situation, how the late Queen would have balanced forgiveness with the need to maintain royal authority. The answers weren't clear, but she knew that whatever happened next would define not just her own reign, but the future of the monarchy itself. 3 weeks after the incident, Queen Camilla made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of avoiding Wellington Barracks or demanding that Harrison be transferred elsewhere, she asked Colonel Pemberton to arrange a private meeting with the Sergeant Major. The request caught the palace staff off guard, and even King Charles raised his eyebrows when she told him what she wanted to do. "Are you certain about this?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. They were having breakfast in their private dining room, away from the staff and the endless stream of advisors who had been offering opinions about how to handle the situation. The media attention alone could be overwhelming. Queen Camilla stirred her tea thoughtfully, watching the steam rise from the delicate china cup. "I've been thinking about this every day since it happened," she said quietly. "Running away from the problem won't solve anything, and punishing Harrison severely will only make him a martyr in some people's eyes." She had spent those 3 weeks doing a lot of soul-searching. The initial hurt and embarrassment had given way to something deeper, a genuine desire to understand why such a dedicated soldier had felt compelled to take such a dramatic stand. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that Harrison's actions, while inappropriate, came from a place of genuine love and loyalty. The meeting was arranged for a Thursday afternoon in the regiment's Memorial Hall, a sacred space within Wellington Barracks where the names of fallen soldiers were inscribed on brass plaques that lined the walls. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating portraits of military heroes from centuries past. If there was anywhere that embodied the honor and sacrifice of military service, this was it. Queen Camilla arrived without the usual royal fanfare. No photographers, no large security detail, no official ceremony. Just her private secretary, and a single protection officer who waited outside. She wanted this conversation to be as normal and honest as possible, given the circumstances. Harrison was already waiting when she entered, standing at attention in his dress uniform. He looked exactly the same as he had 3 weeks earlier, perfectly groomed and professionally composed. But Queen Camilla thought she could see something different in his eyes, a weariness that hadn't been there before. "Please, sit down," she said, gesturing to 2 chairs that had been arranged near a large window. The formal setting felt wrong for what she hoped would be a genuine conversation between 2 people trying to understand each other. Harrison hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the informal approach military protocol dictated. How these interactions should go, and sitting casually with royalty wasn't part of any training manual he had ever studied. But Queen Camilla's gentle smile and patient manner eventually convinced him to take the offered seat. I want you to know, she began, that I didn't ask for this meeting to lecture you or to demand an apology. I'm here because I genuinely want to understand your perspective. The words seemed to catch Harrison off guard. He had spent 3 weeks preparing for various scenarios, including the possibility of a court-martial or immediate dismissal from service. He hadn't prepared for kindness and curiosity. Your Majesty, he started, his voice formal and cautious, I understand that my actions were inappropriate. I accept full responsibility for the embarrassment I caused you and the royal family. Queen Camilla shook her head slightly. That's not what I'm asking about, Sergeant Major. I want to know about Queen Elizabeth. Tell me what she meant to you. The question opened something in Harrison that had been tightly controlled for weeks. His composure cracked just slightly, and for the first time since the incident, he looked like a regular person dealing with grief rather than a soldier following protocol. She was ... double quotes, he paused, searching for the right words. She was the constant in all of our lives, ma'am. When I joined the regiment 23 years ago, she was already this amazing presence. She knew our names, remembered our families, asked about our deployments. She wasn't just a figure on a coin or a portrait on the wall. She was real. Queen Camilla listened without interrupting, understanding that Harrison needed to say these things, perhaps for the first time since Queen Elizabeth's death. When we carried her coffin, Harrison continued, his voice getting quieter, it felt like we were burying our own grandmother. The woman who had been the center of everything we believed in and worked for. And then, suddenly, everything changed. The honesty in his words was painful but necessary. Queen Camilla realized that she wasn't just dealing with one soldier's refusal to salute. She was confronting decades of loyalty and love that didn't know how to redirect itself towards someone new. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been, she said softly. Losing someone who meant so much to you and then being expected to immediately transfer that same level of devotion to someone else. Harrison looked at her with surprise, clearly not expecting such understanding. That's exactly it, ma'am. It felt like betraying her memory somehow. Like we were supposed to forget about her and pretend that the new situation was just as meaningful. Queen Camilla nodded thoughtfully. You know, Sergeant Major, I struggle with the same thing sometimes. Following in Queen Elizabeth's footsteps is terrifying. She set such an incredibly high standard, and I know that many people wonder if I can ever measure up to what she represented. The admission created a moment of connection between them that neither had expected. They were both dealing with the enormous shadow cast by Queen Elizabeth's legacy, just from different sides of the same challenge. The difference is, Queen Camilla continued, I'm not trying to replace her or pretend to be her. I'm trying to find my own way to serve the crown and the people while honoring everything she accomplished. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, processing what he was hearing. This wasn't the conversation he had imagined having with Queen Camilla. He had expected formal reproach or demands for submission. Instead, he was having the kind of honest discussion about grief and change that he might have had with a trusted friend. Ma'am, he said finally, I want you to know that my refusal to salute wasn't personal. It wasn't about you as a person. It was about my own inability to let go of something that had defined my entire adult life. Queen Camilla appreciated his honesty, even though it still stung a little. I understand that, Sergeant Major, but you must also understand that your actions had consequences beyond your personal feelings. The other guards look to you for leadership. The public watches how the military treats the royal family. Your choice affected more than just the two of us. The weight of those consequences was clearly something Harrison had been thinking about during the difficult weeks since the incident. I know, ma'am. I've been struggling with that knowledge every day. I let down my fellow soldiers, my regiment, and my country because I couldn't handle my own emotions properly. Outside the Memorial Hall, London continued its busy rhythm, completely unaware of the quiet conversation happening between two people who had found themselves at the center of a constitutional crisis. Inside, surrounded by the names of soldiers who had died serving the crown, A queen consort and a sergeant major were slowly finding their way toward mutual understanding. "What happens now?" Harrison asked, echoing the same question he had posed to Colonel Pemberton weeks earlier. Queen Camilla was quiet for a moment, looking around at the memorial plaques that honored so many years of military service and sacrifice. When she spoke, her voice carried a new sense of determination and clarity about the path forward. 3 months later, the morning of the official Trooping the Color ceremony dawned bright and clear over London. The same summer sun that had witnessed the previous confrontation now shone down on Horse Guards Parade, where thousands of spectators were gathering for one of Britain's most spectacular royal traditions. But this time, everything felt different. Queen Camilla sat in her dressing room at Buckingham Palace, adjusting her hat one final time before the ceremony. Her hands were steadier than they had been 3 months ago, her confidence rebuilt through weeks of quiet work and gradual acceptance. The woman looking back at her from the mirror had been tested by fire and emerged stronger for it. The conversation with Sergeant Major Harrison had changed something fundamental in how she approached her role. She no longer felt the need to prove herself worthy of every honor or tradition. Instead, she had learned to earn respect through her actions, day by day, engagement by engagement, conversation by conversation. King Charles entered the room resplendent in his military uniform, but his eyes were focused entirely on his wife. "Ready?" he asked, though they both knew the question went deeper than just the ceremony itself. "More ready than I've ever been," she replied, and meant it completely. The journey to Horse Guards Parade took them through streets lined with cheering crowds. Children waved small Union Jack flags, tourists held up phones to capture the moment, and families who had traveled from across Britain pressed against the barriers hoping for a glimpse of the royal family. The warmth of their reception was genuine and heartfelt. At Wellington Barracks, Sergeant Major Harrison was putting the finishing touches on his own preparation. His uniform was immaculate as always, every metal polished to perfection, every crease sharp enough to cut glass. But today there was something different in his demeanor, a sense of peace that had been missing for months. The weeks following his meeting with Queen Camilla had been transformative for him as well. The honest conversation in the Memorial Hall had helped him understand that honoring Queen Elizabeth's memory didn't require rejecting everyone who came after her. True loyalty meant supporting the institution she had devoted her life to building. Colonel Pemberton had watched this transformation with relief and admiration. Instead of the court-martial that many had expected, Harrison had been given additional duties working with military families and veterans. His genuine care for the people he served had found new outlets, and his reputation within the regiment had actually grown stronger. The other guards had noticed the change too. The tension that had filled the barracks for weeks after the original incident had gradually dissolved, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and unity. They respected Harrison's journey from conflict to acceptance, seeing it as a sign of strength rather than weakness. As the ceremony began, Queen Camilla took her place on the saluting platform alongside King Charles and other members of the royal family. The familiar sounds of military bands and marching feet filled the air, creating the soundtrack for a tradition that stretched back centuries. When the Coldstream Guards marched onto the parade ground, Queen Camilla felt her heart rate increase slightly, but not from nervousness. This was anticipation mixed with genuine excitement about what was going to happen. The morning that had once seemed so threatening now felt like an opportunity for healing and new beginnings. Harrison led his unit with the same professional bearing he had always displayed, but those who knew him well could see the difference. His shoulders were relaxed, his face showed quiet confidence rather than rigid tension, and his eyes held warmth that had been missing during those difficult weeks. As the guards approached the saluting platform, time seemed to slow down for both Queen Camilla and Harrison. This was the moment that would define whether their private conversation had truly changed anything, whether understanding could translate into public reconciliation. Harrison called his unit to attention with a voice that carried clearly across the parade ground. The guards responded with perfect precision, their movements synchronized like dancers in an elaborately choreographed performance. Every rifle gleamed in the sunlight, every uniform was immaculate, every face showed the pride of professional soldiers at their finest. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Harrison stepped forward, his eyes meeting Queen Camilla's directly for the first time since their conversation in the memorial hall. The connection between them was brief but meaningful, a recognition of how far they had both traveled since that difficult morning months earlier. "Present arms," Harrison commanded, his voice ringing with authority and genuine respect. The salute that followed was crisp, perfect, and completely sincere. Harrison's own salute was held longer than protocol required, as if he wanted to make absolutely certain that his respect was clearly communicated. The other guards followed his lead with obvious pride, their own salutes reflecting not just military discipline but genuine honor for their queen consort. Queen Camilla acknowledged the salute with the same grace she had shown during their private meeting, but now there was an added warmth in her smile. This wasn't just protocol being followed. This was respect that had been earned and freely given. The crowd erupted in applause, sensing that they had witnessed something special even if they didn't understand all the background details. The photographers captured every moment, but the pictures they took showed celebration rather than confrontation, unity rather than division. As the ceremony continued with its traditional pageantry, both Queen Camilla and Harrison felt a sense of completion that went beyond the successful execution of military protocol. They had found a way to honor the past while embracing the future, to respect Queen Elizabeth's memory while building something new and meaningful after the ceremony. As the crowds dispersed and the guards returned to their barracks, Harrison was approached by several of his fellow soldiers. The young guard who had been so nervous during the original incident was now grinning with pride and relief. "That was perfect, Sergeant Major," he said. "Absolutely perfect." Harrison nodded, but his mind was already moving beyond this single moment. The conversation with Queen Camilla had taught him that respect wasn't a finite resource that could only be given to one person at a time. He could honor Queen Elizabeth's memory while also recognizing Queen Camilla's growing contributions to the monarchy and the country. Back at Buckingham Palace, Queen Camilla was receiving congratulations from family members and palace staff. But the moment that meant the most to her was a brief conversation with King Charles as they returned to their private apartments. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "Not just for today, but for how you handled everything these past few months." She thought back to that terrible morning when she had felt so alone and rejected, wondering if she would ever truly belong in this ancient institution. Now she understood that belonging wasn't something that could be granted or denied by others. It had to be earned through patience, understanding, and a genuine commitment to service. The story that had begun with such public humiliation had evolved into something much more meaningful. It had become a lesson about the power of honest communication, the importance of respecting different perspectives, and the possibility of finding common ground even in the most difficult circumstances. As evening fell over London, both Queen Camilla and Sergeant Major Harrison went to sleep knowing that they had played their parts in writing a new chapter in the long story of the British monarchy. It was a chapter about growth, forgiveness, and the courage to change while still honoring the past. The crown would continue, stronger than before, carried forward by people who had learned that true respect comes not from blind obedience, but from mutual understanding and shared commitment to something greater than themselves.